A warm welcome to everyone in the anesthesia classes. The class for today is a continuation of the previous class, that's the pre-anesthetic assessment part 2, which is a prerequisite for a successful journey in order to reduce the mortality and morbidity of the patient so as to optimize the patient intraoperatively and also to speed up the recovery of the patient and decrease the hospital stay days of the patient. In the last class, we have already covered the history, the general physical examination, the systemic examination, including the airway examination. So today we will be dealing with the review of the medical records, the pre-operative investigation check, and the pre-operative orders. See, one thing that we all have to understand is that if the patient is coming for a surgery, he may be accompanied by concomitant medical conditions too. So, we have to optimize not only that medical condition, but yes, certain level of manipulation of the drugs that the patient is taking have to be done in order to have a best possible optimized patient for the surgery. Now, coming over to certain medical conditions, the foremost and the first that we are going to deal with is hypertension. See, when we are talking about hypertension, the first thing we all have to remember is all the hypertensive drugs have to be continued on the day of the surgery. BHB, your beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, your vasodilators, all have to be continued on the day of the surgeries, including the ACE inhibitors and the ARBs. The only exceptions when the ACE inhibitors and the ARBs have to be stopped is any surgery which involves a major fluid shift. In that case, the ACE inhibitors and ARBs have to be stopped. Secondly, the diuretics. The diuretics have to be stopped on the day of the surgery except thiazides. And when the patient is taking diuretics, one of the investigation which is very important for us are the potassium levels. The next thing that is important is the beta blockers. See, the beta blockers, alpha agonists, calcium channel blockers all have to be continued. If you don't continue them, then abrupt discontinuation of such drugs can lead to rebound hypertension. When we are talking about beta blockers, one thing that is frequently asked is when should we start the beta blockers? See, the beta blockers should never be started on the day of the surgery. Never start the beta blockers on the day of the surgery because we have to give optimal time to the patient to adapt to the effects of the beta blockers. So the optimal time to start beta blockers is 2 to 7 days prior to surgery. So that is the twist when we are using the beta blockers. One more twist is there when we are using the diuretics, that is the exception when the diuretics have to be continued on the day of the surgery also. That is in cases who have a decompensated congestive heart failure. If you are dealing with such a case who has a CHF, in that case the diuretics have to be continued on the day of the surgery as well. When we are talking about hypertension, we have to be very careful that it takes around 4 to 6 weeks for the patient to get optimized, especially when posted for a elective surgery. Okay, how much time will it take for the patient to get optimized is 4 to 6 weeks. Done. Then there are two types of hypertension. See, one is yes, the patient is chronically hypertensive. The second type of hypertension that we generally deal with is white coat hypertension, in which the patient is only apprehensive and anxious, because of which the blood pressure comes raised when he visits the OPDs or the PSC clinics. To deal with such cases, the first is relaxation technique for the patient, Or secondly, we can ask the patient to take the records of the blood pressure morning and the evening for 1 week and then come back to us with those records. In hypertension patients, the one thing that we all have to take care is, for example, this is a graph, MAP, mean arterial pressure, versus the perfusion pressure. If this is the normal graph, in a hypertensive patient, the body homeostasis has maintaining this graph with a rightward shift, which means that to maintain the same perfusion pressure of the vital organs, a higher blood pressure is needed. So, when we are targeting the blood pressure of a hypertensive patient, especially intraoperatively, for example, if we have taken the patient at 170 by 90 millimeters of mercury, our target is always to decrease the blood pressure not more than 25% of the baseline, because the perfusion pressure to the vital organs has a rightward shift and is maintained at a higher MEP than a normotensive patient. So we don't have to bring the blood pressure to normal, that is like 120 by 80. It is only a 25% decrease from the baseline we are targeting. And the last thing we all have to remember is, what is the blood pressure reading above which the case has to be postponed? And that is 180 by 100 millimeters of mercury. Above this, we postpone any elective case. Moving to the second condition, that is the myocardial infarction or acute coronary syndrome. When we are dealing with a patient of myocardial infarction, there are four things that we have to keep in mind. First is the timing of MI, which could be an acute MI within 30 days. Less than 30 days, the patient had suffered from a MI. Subacute MI, the patient had suffered from an MI between 30 days to 1 year. And chronic MI, which is more than 1 year. Okay, we have to look from the history when actually the MI took place. The second thing is the intervention. What was the intervention done? The intervention could be of two types. One is the coronary revascularization, or only the pharmacological therapy was given to the patient. Then we have to see about the medication the patient is on. That is the dose and the frequency of the medication the patient is taking, and since what time the patient has been on these medications. And lastly, and most importantly, that is the cardiopulmonary reserve of the patient. That is the functional status of the patient. Because you all know that surgery itself is a very stressful condition in which a lot of catecholamines are released, which have adverse effect on the myocardium. Thus, we have to know the cardiopulmonary reserve of the patient, or the patient could maintain itself at that stress level. One by one, we are going to come on all these four conditions. The first thing is the cardiopulmonary reserve, or the functional status of the patient. The physical functional capacity of the patient can be judged just via the history of the patient. The history of the patient has to include the MET scoring. The MET scoring stands for metabolic equivalent. This definition of MET scoring is of utmost importance, and each and every word of this is a potential question. One MET is the resting or the basal oxygen consumption of a 40-year-old 70 kg man, which is equivalent to 3.5 ml per kg per minute. This is equal to 1 MET. By 1 MET we mean, for example, a person can walk around less than 100 steps, or the person can do washing, or he can go to his washroom, etc. This is just the 1 MET. Accordingly, The METs could be like 4 METs. If the patient is able to climb a flight of stairs, that is 20 steps he can take, or he can do a light work around the house like dusting or washing the dishes, or we can have a person who has MET scoring more than 10, that is he can participate in strenuous sports like swimming, football, basketball, etc. So this is how the MET scoring of the patient is taken via the history of the patient. The other important index which was developed to judge the functional capacity of the patient is the Duke Activity Index. So there are two things that can be used to judge the cardiopulmonary reserve of the patient via the history. One is the MET scoring, which is equivalent to 3.5 ml per kg per minute. That is, for example, if the patient has 4 METs, so the basal oxygen consumption of the patient would be 3.5 into 4, that is 14 ml per kg per minute. And what is the importance of this will come to know a bit later. And the second index could be the Duke Activity Index. Now coming over that if the patient had a recent MI and has been posted for elective surgery, the surgery has to be delayed at least for 4 to 6 weeks. The recommended delay of the surgery of a patient with recent MI in which no coronary revascularization was done is 4 to 6 weeks. Now, I told you interventions could be of two types. One could be pharmacological and other could be coronary revascularization. Now, let's talk about suppose the patient had undergone a coronary vascularization. This could be like maybe the patient had undergone angioplasty. If the patient has undergone angioplasty, so any surgery has to be delayed at least for 14 days. If the patient has got a bare metal stent, then the surgery has to be delayed at least for 30 days. And if the patient had drug-eluting stent, then the surgery has to be delayed for around 1 year. And if the patient had undergone CABG, then at least for 3 months, the surgery has to be delayed. I repeat because this duration of time is very important. If the patient had undergone an angioplasty, then 14 days is the recommended time. Any elective surgery has to be delayed. If the patient has gone under bare metal stent, then 30 days, drug-eluting stent 1 year, and CABG is 3 months. And this time is because when the patient gets a stenting done, he's always started on dual antiplatelet therapy. And this is the minimum time for which the dual antiplatelet therapy should go in order to reduce the chances of thrombosis. Now, when we come to a patient of acute coronary syndrome, the patient posted for a non-cardiac surgery. A cardiac patient who has been posted for a non-cardiac surgery, the risk stratification for such a case is done by using the Lee's Cardiac Risk Index, and the other name for Lee Cardiac Risk Index is Revised Cardiac Risk Index. This is the easiest and the most commonly used cardiac risk index. It has 6 components which have to be remembered. So the Lee's cardiac risk index states a history of ischemic heart disease, a history of congestive heart failure, a history of stroke or transient ischemic attack, a patient who is diabetic on insulin therapy, a patient with a preoperative creatinine of more than 2 mg per deciliter, or a patient who's undergoing a high risk surgery. Okay, out of the 6, as the score increases, so does the risk of major adverse cardiac events also keep on increasing. Okay, I repeat, the least cardiac risk index is a clinical risk stratification for a patient who is undergoing a non-cardiac surgery, but the patient is itself a cardiac patient. Now coming over to certain drugs that these patients can be on, like anti-anginal drugs or anticoagulant drugs. Mostly these patients are taking aspirin. See, there are two doses of aspirin that are asked in questions. One is 75 milligram till 150 milligram, and the second dose that's asked is above 150 milligrams till around 325 milligrams. See, when we are talking about low dose aspirin, the low dose aspirin can be continued till the day of the surgery also, until and unless there are exceptions to it. If we are dealing with those surgeries in which the control of the bleeding is very difficult, like cataract surgeries, ophthalmic surgeries, posterior fossa surgeries, or the spine surgeries. In those cases, even low dose aspirin have to be stopped at least 7 days prior to surgery. Or in cases in which bleeding can be stopped, or they are not very high risk hemorrhagic cases, 75 mg can be continued. But when we are dealing with high dose of aspirin, the high dose of aspirin has to be stopped at least 7 days prior to the surgery. Second important drug that comes is clopidogrel. The clopidogrel has to be stopped around 5 days before the surgery to decrease the risk of hemorrhage. Then ticlopidine. Ticlopidine has to be stopped around 10 to 14 days prior to surgery. Coming over a yet very important drug, which is the vitamin K antagonist, that is the warfarin. The warfarin has to be stopped at around 5 days prior to surgery. And which are the factors which warfarin actually inhibit? That's the star question. Factor 2, 7, 9 and 10. Perfect. Then dealing with certain newer anticoagulant drugs, one of the most important is Abixaban, that has to be stopped around 48 hours prior to surgery. Rivaroxaban, it has to be stopped again 48 hours before the surgery. Abiximab has to be stopped around 2 days prior to surgery. And a very recently introduced drug is eptifibatide. This eptifibatide drug is important because the half-life of this drug is very short, and thus it can be continued at least 8 hours prior to surgery also. So very helpful in those cases with the risk of stent thrombosis is very high, and such patients the risk of hemorrhage is also very high. So in such cases, eptifibatide can be used and can be stopped only 8 hours prior to surgery. And then dealing with the heparins. We have two types of heparin. Unfractionated heparin, if being given in prophylactic doses, has to be stopped 6 hours prior to surgery. If therapeutic dose is being given, it has to be stopped 12 hours prior to surgery. Talking about your enoxaparin, enoxaparin has to be stopped prophylactically if being given 12 hours prior to surgery, therapeutic 24 hours prior to surgery. Whereas fondaparinux has to be stopped prophylactically if being given around 48 hours prior to surgery and 72 hours if therapeutic drug dose is being given. All these drugs which I have marked are very important to remember on the point of view of your MCQs, especially the heparins, the warfarin and the clopidogrel and the aspirin. Now when we are talking about the anti-anginal drugs, the other thing that comes in mind is the interaction of these drugs with other antiplatelet drugs. See, when we are talking about aspirin, one interaction that you all have to remember is the interaction of aspirin with NSAIDs. Okay, if the patient is on NSAIDs and aspirin, this NSAIDs have to be stopped 48 hours prior to surgery. This is like a star marked question. If the patient is on aspirin plus NSAIDs, the NSAIDs have to be stopped 48 hours prior to surgery. And can you all guess why the 7-day time is given? Why 7 days was selected for aspirin? Yes, 7 days is the time for the rejuvenation of your platelets. The half life of your platelets is 7 days, and after 7 days, you can have the new platelets. Now, moving forwards, see, when we are talking about the case of a non cardiac surgery for a cardiac patient, there are various things that are being asked these days. The one of these things is the clinical predictors of increased perioperative cardiac risk. That is, which are the predictors which can help us in knowing whether this case can have any major adverse cardiac event or not. So these predictors can be divided into major, intermediate and minor category. It is very difficult to remember each and every of them. So let's have a brief introduction of how to remember it. For example, when we are dealing with the major predictors, see, all the major predictors would be highly unstable. Unstable coronary syndrome, a decompensated heart failure, significant arrhythmias, or severe valvular disease. Everything that is severe, may it be heart failure, a arrhythmia, a valve disease, or coronary syndrome. Then the intermediate are the most important of the intermediate risk factor is your diabetes and renal insufficiency. Your diabetes and renal insufficiency are intermediate risk factors of major adverse cardiac events. And when we talk about minor are your geriatric patients, patients with a history of stroke, and uncontrolled systemic hypertension is only a minor factor in increasing the perioperative cardiac risk. So there are certain things which are being asked in the previous years. So I'm emphasizing only on them so that you can remember at least them. The major is something which is highly unstable. Intermediate are your diabetes and renal insufficiency, whereas minor are your geriatric patient, a patient with a history of stroke, or a patient with an uncontrolled systemic hypertension. Moving forward, there is one more risk stratification which is frequently asked, which is based upon the surgery that the patient is going to undergo. That is high risk, intermediate risk, and low risk. That is the risk of cardiac events. In high risk surgery, we have major vascular surgeries. In intermediate, the most commonly asked is the carotid endarterectomies and the prostate surgeries. Whereas in low risk surgeries, we have cataract surgeries and the breast surgeries. I repeat, there is a stratification, risk stratification based upon which surgery the patient is going to go through, which is high, more than 5%, intermediate 1 to 5%, and low less than 1%. In high risk, we have major surgeries like vascular surgeries, whereas in intermediate, we have intraperitoneal, intrathoracic, carotid endarterectomy, prostate, and orthopedic surgeries. In low risk, we have cataracts, breast, and ambulatory surgeries. Now, when we have to deal with such a patient, there are some questions which are asked according to the case scenarios. Certain case scenarios have become very common these days, and these case scenarios are generally coming from this very table. So let's have a quick revision or a quick look through in this table. See, when we are dealing with such a patient, and suppose this patient has undergone a stenting, right? So these patients are at a very high risk of thrombosis of the stenting if their dual antiplatelet therapies or the aspirin is stopped before the recommended time. Now let's see. First of all, when dealing with this patient, we have to deal with the thrombotic risk of the patient. A patient will have a high thrombotic risk if he had gone bare metal stent, he has a bare metal stent, but still the dual antiplatelet therapy has been given only for less than 6 weeks. So that's a very high category. Or the dual drug eluting stent, the therapy has been given only for less than 12 months. Sorry, less than 6 months. That is high. When we are talking about the high thrombotic risk, it means that the patient had undergone stenting. If it was a bare metal stent, then barely the patient had 6 weeks of therapy. And when we are talking about the drug eluting stent, then the patient had only less than 6 months of the therapy, and now the patient is being posted for a case. Now, if we can delay such a case, then we have to delay the case. Okay. And now, if we cannot delay the case, suppose it's an emergency case or a time sensitive case, then we have to test or judge about the hemorrhagic risk that the surgery has. Now, according to the hemorrhagic risk, again we can divide into high, intermediate, or low. Like I've already told about the surgical stratification, high, intermediate, and the minor surgeries. So, if it is a high hemorrhagic risk surgery, so whatever the case may, we have to discontinue the dual antiplatelet therapy for the patient. That the patient is generally on aspirin or clopidogrel, which has to be stopped. In case we have a high hemorrhagic risk surgery, the dual antiplatelet therapy has to be discontinued. Then what to do about the thrombosis now? For the thrombosis, we can maintain the patient either on aspirin alone, or we can consider something which is known as the bridging therapy. See, the bridging therapy is of very importance. What is bridging therapy? That the patient is on dual antiplatelet drugs which are stopped around 3 to 5 days prior to a major surgery, and the patient is shifted on heparin, especially low molecular weight or subcutaneous heparin, or IV heparin, which are the unfractionated heparin. And these are then stopped according to the prophylactic or the therapeutic dose which are being given. Generally, such patients will be on therapeutic doses. So, a quick recap: the unfractionated heparin has to be stopped 12 hours prior, and the low molecular weight heparin, if enoxaparin, then 24 hours prior to the surgery, and fondaparinux have to be stopped 72 hours prior if therapeutic doses have to be started in this patient. And then post-operatively, the patient is shifted back to the dual antiplatelet therapy. This is the bridging therapy which is recommended only in the cases where there is a high hemorrhagic risk surgery and you cannot delay the surgery. Now, dealing with the intermediate thrombotic risk, the intermediate is where the bare metal stent has been given at least more than 12 weeks but less than 6 months, whereas the drug eluting stent have been given between 6 to 12 months. So this is the intermediate category of thrombotic risk. You can delay, please delay. And if you cannot delay the surgery, then again the hemorrhagic risk is taken. The hemorrhagic risk could be a high, intermediate, or low hemorrhagic risk. If it is a high hemorrhagic risk, then you have to discontinue your dual antiplatelet therapy and maintain the patient only on aspirin. If it is intermediate, then in both the cases we can maintain the patient only on aspirin. If it is a low hemorrhagic risk surgery, then we can continue with the dual antiplatelet therapy also. Okay. Now coming with the low thrombotic risk cases. The very low thrombotic risk cases means already the recommended duration of the dual antiplatelet therapy has been finished. That is, the bare metal stent has been there for at least 6 months and drug eluting stent has been there for at least more than 12 months. Now, if we test the hemorrhagic risk, if it is high, discontinue the dual antiplatelet therapy, that's okay. If it is intermediate risk, you can maintain only on aspirin, or even if aspirin is not given, it is fine. And if it is a low uh, hemorrhagic risk surgery, then you can even continue on dual antiplatelet therapy for such patients who have a low risk of hemorrhage. In a nutshell, if the question states that if a patient has undergone coronary angioplasty, wait for a minimum of 14 days. A bare metal stent, wait for a minimum of 30 days. If a drug eluting stent, wait for minimum of 1 year. But in case such a case is being posted, then what to do? Then we have to judge about the thrombotic risk versus the hemorrhagic risk. If the thrombotic risk is very high, delay the surgery if possible. If the surgery cannot be delayed, then judge the hemorrhagic risk. If it is a high hemorrhagic risk, go for bridging therapy. If it is an intermediate hemorrhagic risk, you can continue with your dual antiplatelet therapy or the bridging therapy. If it is a low hemorrhagic risk, then you can continue with your dual antiplatelet therapy. If it is an intermediate thrombotic risk surgery, delay it. If you can't delay it, then again judge the hemorrhagic risk of the patient, high, intermediate, or low. If it is high hemorrhagic risk, discontinue your dual antiplatelet therapy. If it is intermediate, you can give aspirin. If it is low hemorrhagic risk, then dual antiplatelet therapy can be continued. If it is a low thrombotic risk, already the time which is recommended is already finished, then there is no issues. If the hemorrhagic risk is very high, discontinue your dual antiplatelet therapy. And if the hemorrhagic risk is low, then you can continue your dual antiplatelet therapy in these patients. Now coming, one thing that you all have to remember is, foremost, it is your clinical judgment which is very, very important in dealing with these cases, and yes, in dealing with the case scenarios of your MCQs also. You have to judge what is the risk versus benefit ratio of the patient according to the question, the risk of thrombosis versus the risk of hemorrhage, for which you all have to remember the time durations for the coronary revascularization and the type of surgery the patient is going to go through. So next thing that is important for us is the prophylaxis of infective endocarditis. See, every case of valvular heart disease or any congenital heart disease should not be given a prophylaxis of infective endocarditis. Now, when the prophylaxis is needed are only certain exceptional cases which you have to know, because certain questions which come are like, out of which is the correct, or except this, the infective endocarditis has to be given to all. So the scenarios in which antibiotic for infective endocarditis has to be given are: first, patients with any prosthetic valve. First. Second, the patient already had a previous episode of infective endocarditis. Third, the patient had cyanotic congenital heart disease. Please remember, it is cyanotic congenital heart disease. Okay. And last, any type of congenital heart disease which has been repaired with a prosthetic material, as I've already stated, plus it has been placed at least not more than 6 months from your surgery, then this has to be always given, right? Any patient who had a prosthetic valve is a candidate for the antibiotic prophylaxis. Any previous episode of infective endocarditis, cyanotic congenital heart disease, and lastly, if the surgery has been done within 6 months or there is a lifelong residual shunt which is there in the patient. So moving forward, the next very important thing that comes when we are dealing with such cases is the perioperative cardiac assessment of these cases. So this is the era of minimum investigations which have to be done as per the requirements. So the first thing that we have to see when we're dealing with, I'm again and again repeating the case that this is valid only for a non-cardiac surgery in a cardiac patient. Okay. The perioperative cardiac assessment includes a lot of tests, right? For example, we have ECGs, we have echoes, we have pharmacological testings, we have myocardial perfusion scans, we have coronary angiographies, and etc., etc., etc. But not all the tests are required when we are dealing with a cardiac patient. The first MCQ that is asked is, suppose the patient has undergone a full cardiac evaluation for within 2 years of being posted for a surgery and no new functional limitation has arisen in that patient. No new functional limitation. So, the investigations which are within 2 years of period is valid. Is it understandable? If the patient has undergone the whole cardiac evaluation within the 2 years period and no new functional limitation has come up, so that investigation is valid. Done? Now, when we are talking about the perioperative cardiac assessment, see, when we are dealing with this, we have to divide our patients into high, intermediate, and low risk again. And these risks are given according to the MET scoring of the patient. In brief, if the MET scoring of the patient is more than 4, then no further testing is needed in the patient. No further testing other than the routine testing that is done. Nothing has to be done, right? But if the patient has MET scoring of less than 4, and especially if the patient has to go any high risk surgery in which the risk of cardiac event is more than 1%, then we have to undergo other additional tests. But that too only if these tests are going to affect your plan of management. I repeat, when we are dealing with the cardiac assessment of a cardiac case, if the MET scoring is more than 4, then no further testing is required than your routine testing. But if the MET scoring is less than 4 and the patient has to undergo a high risk or intermediate risk surgery, then additional tests are required. But that are required only if they are going to change your plan of management. Okay, the additional tests that we can do in a cardiac patients are echocardiography, stress echocardiography, and most importantly, cardiopulmonary exercise testing is done in patients. I have already told you about the functional status of the patient that we can judge through the history of the patient by taking the MET scoring or the Duke Activity Index. But we can also do certain tests which can help us in knowing the cardiopulmonary exercise testing capacity of that patient. And this is important because this gives us a value of anaerobic threshold of the patient. See, this term is very important and recently introduced and asked too. What is anaerobic threshold? When we talk about the anaerobic threshold, what are we actually looking for? We are actually looking for how much stress the patient's body can bear. That is, above what oxygen consumption our aerobic metabolism is no longer be able to cope up with the energy production. That is, now the anaerobic mechanism have to come and help our aerobic mechanism to produce the ATPs that are required for the body's metabolic rate. That is what is anaerobic threshold. What does anaerobic threshold means? That now the body is no longer being able to cope up with the energy production only by using the aerobic metabolism, and thus this increases the production of lactic acid and eventually leading to metabolic acidosis in the patient. Anaerobic threshold, once achieved, will lead to lactic acidosis, and eventually the patient is going to land up in metabolic acidosis. The normal anaerobic threshold for us is 9 to 11 ml of oxygen consumption per kg per minute. Please remember this value. This is the normal anaerobic threshold, that is 9 to 11 ml of oxygen consumption per kg per minute. Coming over to the pharmacological testing in those patients, for example, orthopedic patients or geriatric patients who cannot undergo exercise testing, they can have dobutamine stress test or adenosine stress test. Two drugs that are used for pharmacological stress testing are dobutamine and adenosine. Perfect. The next investigation that we can come is myocardial perfusion scans. Myocardial perfusion scans are basically done to check for the reversible perfusion defects of the myocardium. All you have to remember is the three most important radionuclides which are used to do this: MPI, thallium 201, rubidium 82, and technetium 99. These are three radioisotopes which are used to see the perfusion of the myocardium. And lastly is the coronary angiography. Coronary angiography is not recommended. Peri-operatively, there is no recommendation of doing coronary angiography. Now, coming over to the psychiatric medications, I hope the part of the cardiac medication is well understood by all. Now, when we are dealing with the psychiatric medication, one thing we have to remember is that abrupt withdrawal of the psychiatric medication can lead to discontinuation syndromes in the patient. Okay, so all antipsychotic medications, your tricyclic antidepressants, your anti-maniac, your medications for bipolar disorders, all the medications have to be continued till on the day of the surgery also, with the exceptions of lithium. Lithium has to be stopped 24 to 48 hours prior to surgery because it is said to potentiate the effect of neuromuscular blockers. That is why it is stopped. Second is certain older generation of MAO-A inhibitors like selegiline had to be stopped 3 weeks prior to surgery because these inhibitors interacted with catecholamines which are released during the stressful condition of surgery, and first finally leading to serotonin syndrome, because of which these were stopped 3 weeks prior to surgery. Then the newly introduced serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they all have to be continued. Your tricyclic antidepressants have to be continued. So there are only two drugs in psychotics which have to be stopped. One is lithium and the other are old MAO-A inhibitors. Coming to epilepsy, all anti-epileptic drugs have to be continued, right? And what is said to be a well-controlled epilepsy? It is when there are no episodes on medication in the past 2 years. That is a well-controlled epilepsy, and no further testing is required in such a patient in which no episode of epilepsy has occurred since 2 years and the patient is on regular medications. But all anti-epileptic drugs can derange your liver functions. So kindly get the liver function test done in epileptic patients. Moving to the one more very important condition, that is the diabetes mellitus. You all must be knowing India is the world capital of diabetes mellitus. So when we are dealing with the diabetes mellitus, again we have three questions that are in mind. One, the duration of diabetes. Why? The duration of diabetes is very important because diabetes leads to certain microvascular and macrovascular complications. So, in order to know whether the patient has any of these developed, for example, retinopathy, nephropathy, chiroarthropathy, etc., we have to negate all the negative history from the patient and yet know the exact duration since what the patient has been suffering from diabetes. The second very important thing is whether the diabetes is controlled or it is uncontrolled. And lastly, what are the medications, the dose, the frequency the patient is on. In diabetes mellitus case, there are certain very particular and peculiar MCQs that come. The first, diabetes mellitus should always be taken as the first case of the day because these patients are very prone to hypoglycemias also. Okay, so we can't keep these patients fasting for very long. The recommended levels of fasting blood sugar are less than 180 millimeters of mercury, or if asked a range, then 140 to 180 millimeters of deciliter, sorry I told mercury, milligrams of deciliter is the range in which the glycemic control has to be maintained. Please remember the tight glycemic control is now no longer recommended. Okay, because that made patients very prone to hypoglycemia. So now the fasting blood sugar levels are 140 to 180, which are recommended and acceptable for any elective surgery. The postprandial blood sugar levels have to be less than 200 milligrams per deciliter. Your HbA1c has to be less than 9. Please remember the HbA1c levels for elective surgeries have to be less than 9 because this is going to show us, yes, the control for 3 months. And do you know the star one? Why 3 months? Yes, because HbA1c is the hemoglobin that you find on RBCs and the half-life of RBCs is 120 days. Perfect. All oral hypoglycemic drugs have to be stopped on the day of the surgery with the exception of metformin, which has to be stopped 48 hours prior to surgery because this leads to lactic acidosis. And in case there is a major surgery in which you have to shift the patient from OHA to insulin, so please do it at least 5 days prior to surgery. The shift is done to maintain the plasma concentration or to see how the body reacts to insulin and what level of control is there. So these are certain peculiar questions of diabetes mellitus which are generally asked. Now coming over to the insulin. What dose of the insulin has to be given a day prior to surgery and on day of the surgery? There are 4 types of insulins that generally the patient can be on. The first is the basal insulin, the long-acting insulin like Glargine. A day prior to surgery, you have to decrease the dose by 20%. And on the day of the surgery also, the dose has to be decreased on 20%. But with the exceptions, if the basal insulin that the patient is taking is around 80 units or above. Secondly, out of the total dose of insulin that the patient is taking, more than 60% of the insulin requirement is met by the long-acting insulin, then the dose has to be decreased by 50%. a day prior as well as on the day of the surgery. The dose has to be decreased by 50% in these two exceptional cases, in which the dose of the long acting insulin on which the control is there is around 80 units, or 60% of the total dose that the patient is taking of insulin is the long acting insulin. In that case, the dose has to be decreased by 50%. And if this all has to be done, it has to be done at least 3 days prior to surgery. When we talk about the second type of insulin the patient can be on, that is the intermediate acting insulin. A day prior to surgery, usual dose that is being taken has to be taken. On day of the surgery, if required, that is the blood sugars are more than 100 milligram per deciliter, then 50% of the total dose can be given. Then pre-mixed insulin, which are quite used these days. A day prior to surgery, usual dose can be given, and on day of the surgery, less than, that is 50% decrease of the dose has to be there. Then prandial insulin, the insulin which is given, which is very ultra short acting insulin, day prior usual, on day of surgery no prandial insulin is given, because this gives a, it gives a trough which is very very high and can lead to hypoglycemia. So the only insulin that has to be omitted on the day of the surgery is the prandial insulin. Rest all types of insulin, the dose has to be adjusted according to the blood sugar levels. But please remember, the blood sugar levels pre-operatively have to be checked too early if the patient is on insulin and fasting. Okay, I know most of you must be thinking that the patient is fasting, yet why are we giving insulin? Please remember, surgery releases a lot of catecholamines, a lot of catabolic hormones, which leads to increase in glucose production, which can be quite detrimental to such patients. That is the main reason why insulin is continued, taking into account the blood sugar levels. And one investigation which is very important in these patients who are on insulin is potassium, because insulin leads to hypokalemias. Okay, I'll tell you a star question here. What is the level of potassium, serum potassium, below which no insulin is ever given to a patient? It is 3 millimoles per deciliter. This is the level of potassium below which insulin should never be given. First, we have to replenish the potassium, and then insulin is restarted. Now coming over to the thyroid, every elective case of a thyroid patient has to be taken only when the patient becomes euthyroid. Okay, you have to make the patient euthyroid before the elective case and then take it. Generally, when we are dealing with hyperthyroidism, it takes around 6 to 8 weeks for the patient to get optimized, and when we are dealing with hypothyroidism, it can take around 3 to 6 months for the patient, because slowly and steadily the dose of thyroxine is changed. Okay, fine. One more star question. Why can't you give thyroxine fast? Why can't you start the patient directly on 100 micrograms of thyroxine? Because thyroid hormones are known to increase the activity of the myocardium. And if thyroid hormones are given at a very fast rate, it can make the patients prone to CHF or myocardium disorders. That is the main reason why sequential increase of the thyroxine is done. All the hypothyroid medications have to be continued on the day of the surgery to avoid mixed edema coma, and all the Hyperthyroid medication also have to be continued on the day of the surgery to avoid thyrotoxicosis crisis, with the exception of carbimazole. Yeah, these exceptions are very, very important because these become some very recently and a choice questions for the examiners to ask. Carbimazole has to be stopped around 48 hours prior to surgery because this drug is increasing the vascularity of the thyroid gland. So this drug is stopped. Other than that, one thing we have to remember, if the patient is on hyperthyroid medications, generally propylthiouracil, you must have all read about it, and carbimazole are the drugs that the patient is on. These drugs can lead to agranulocytosis, or even carbimazole can lead to aplastic anemias. So testing of CBC, hemoglobin, platelets is a must for the patient who are chronically on hyperthyroid medications. Coming to upper respiratory tract infections, see what happens when a patient has a URTI is that the airway becomes hyperactive, right? So if the airway becomes hyperactive, so it increases the chances of laryngospasm as well as bronchospasm. And thus, if any elective case, please postpone the case by at least 6 weeks to restore the normal reactivity of the airway. Talking about the obstructive and the restrictive lung diseases, or you can say lung disorders, specific testing that is required in such cases is the pulmonary function test. Now, when we are talking about the lung disorders, one thing very briefly that I want all of you to know is, if we are dealing with the case of, thoracotomies. So this becomes very important because this is very specific. If the questions state that the case has been posted for thoracotomies or pneumonectomy, that is a lung part has to be resected, then which investigation is very, very important? And that investigation is the three-legged stool test, which has three components that you all have to remember. First is the respiratory mechanics, which is FEV1. The first test that is done is FEV1. Done. The second, we check the cardiopulmonary reserve, which we check by the oxygen consumption, which has to be around 15 ml per kg per minute. No need to remember the what is the limit for it. Just remember we have to check the oxygen consumption. And last, we check the diffusion capacity of the lung by using carbon monoxide. So these three tests have to be done in patients who have been posted for lung resections: FEV1, oxygen consumption, and diffusion capacity via carbon monoxide. Coming over to the strokes, if the patient has the stroke, elective non-cardiac surgeries have to be performed after 9 months because there is increased risk of complications. So 9 months is the time which has been recommended if the patient had a stroke and he has to undergo an elective surgery now, with the exception that sometimes these patients have valve problems, because of which they are very prone to clots in their atria, and that clot gets dislodged and goes into your cerebral perfusion. So in those patients, the exception is that yes, within 3 months of the stroke, the patient can undergo a cardiac surgery for the surgical aortic valve replacement. That is the only exception, that if valvular uh, replacement surgery has to be done, it can be done within 3 months of the stroke. Now, coming over to certain miscellaneous drugs that are asked or used, your oral contraceptives. Oral contraceptives have to be stopped at least 4 weeks, especially if it is high dose estrogen. Progesterone need not stop, low dose estrogen need not stop, because high dose estrogen increases the chances of embolism. That is why it has to be stopped at least 4 weeks prior to surgery. Then anti-tubercular drugs. Need not stop it, continue the drugs, but please check the LFTs for any drug-induced hepatitis. Herbal medications. Herbal medications have to be stopped at least 14 days prior to surgery, because these drugs are known for their bleeding diathesis. Okay? And kindly check your LFTs and RFTs also when the patient is on chronic herbal medications. NSAIDs, as already I have told you, that when you're taking NSAIDs, especially along with aspirin, then 48 hours prior to surgery, you should stop your NSAIDs. Sildenafil, again a very potent vasodilator. It has to be stopped 24 hours prior to surgery. Diuretics, we have already discussed. All the diuretics have to be stopped except thiazides. Then levodopa, which is generally given in patients of Parkinsonism, has to be continued, or you can remember it like all the psychiatric medications are continued. So levodopa has to be continued. Then Viagra, again a very potent vasodilator, has to be stopped 24 hours prior to surgery. Then your anticholinergics, which is given for myasthenia gravis, have to be continued but in reduced doses. This is important. Anticholinergics can be given but in reduced doses. If the patient is on any topical ointment, then on the day of the surgery you have to stop, because sometimes we have some skin preparations so that can interact with each other. Disulfiram, alcohol withdrawal, stop 10 days prior to surgery. Methadone, maintain it. Naltrexone, stop 3 days prior to surgery. Or your thrombolytics. See, these three are like very rarely asked questions, these three. So you can, if you want, you can even skip all these. Then the thrombolytic and fibrinolytic drugs like streptokinase, LT plus, Reti plus, they have to be stopped at least 10 days. That is, if the patient was given streptokinase, kindly avoid doing an elective case within 10 days of that drug. Aminoglycosides have been quite controversial, because aminoglycosides are known to potentiate the effect of the neuromuscular blockers, but you need not stop these drugs. Aminoglycoside as antibiotic, if being given, you kindly don't stop that. Coming over to yet very important, that is our steroids. See, when we talk about steroids, if the patient is on prednisolone and the patient is regularly taking it, like around 5 milligrams per day for 3 weeks, any 3 weeks in the prior 1 year, the patient had that steroid. So intraoperative supplementation with hydrocortisone is very important, because this intake of steroid leads to obtundation of the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So the normal catecholamine release, which are actually needed by the body, is no longer there. Thus, hydrocortisone supplementation is very important in the patients who have been taking steroids. That is, prednisolone is being taken in those patients. hydrocortisone has to be given. Exceptions, again very important: diabetes, immunocompromised, or the patient who are suffering from any active infection. Now, talking about the smoking, see, when we come to smoking, what is the best time when the smoking can be stopped? Anytime. The best time is as soon as possible the smoking is stopped is the best time for smoking, because even if the smoking is stopped 12 hours prior to surgery, you can see a fall in the carbon monoxide and nicotine levels. But the best optimal time is 6 to 8 weeks. Okay, if asked what is the best optimal time to stop smoking, that is 6 to 8 weeks prior to surgery, because this time is needed for the normalization of the immune functions. And in case the mortality has to be the same like any non-smoker, then at least 12 weeks have to be there to decrease the overall post-operative morbidity of the patient. But most commonly that the time duration be given to you all will be 6 to 8 weeks. Prior to surgery, smoking has to be stopped. Coming over to alcohol, alcohol has to be stopped at least 24 hours prior to surgery, and tobacco has to be stopped because it has very high nicotine levels, which is a very strong vasoconstrictor, at least 4 to 6 weeks prior to surgery. These are the three things, the three addictions which are very common in patients, and you all have to remember that. Smoking, it is 6 to 8 weeks, which is the optimal time at least for which the smoking has to be stopped before any elective surgery. Talking about alcohol, 24 hours, and tobacco at least 4 to 6 weeks. Coming to the family history, in the family history, malignant hyperthermia is something which I forgot to tell in the last class. It is very important to rule out. And in allergic history, it is very important to rule out any allergy to any aminosteroids, to latex, and lastly to any antibiotics. Okay. Now, when we have done all this, the history has been taken of all the comorbidities and everything, and now we know for what the patient has been posted with, we have to stratify the patient. And the easiest and the most commonly used stratification is the American Society of Anesthesiologists Physical Status Classification, that is the ASA classification, and a number of case scenarios and questions come over using this stratifications. So please let's memorize this stratification. ASA 1, normal patient, nothing. ASA 2, we have a mild systemic disease, but there is no functional limitation in the patient. In this category, we have controlled patients like controlled hypertensives, controlled diabetics, and most importantly, we have pregnancy. Pregnant patients fall into ASA 2, and obese patients with BMI of less than 40 kg per meter square fall into ASA 2 category. Now, ASA 3 is the patient has a severe systemic disease with functional limitation. A disease which has a functional limitation like uncontrolled hypertension, an acute exacerbation of COPD, uncontrolled diabetes, or obese more than 40 kg per meter square, or the patient has CRF. All these are ASA 3 patient. There is a severe systemic disease with functional limitation. ASA 4 is there is a systemic disease, and that disease is a constant threat to life. Okay, there is a severe systemic disease the patient is suffering from, and that disease is a constant threat, like end stage renal disease. It is a constant threat to life. Or you can have varices, which is a constant threat to life, or a patient who is suffering from hepatic encephalopathy. Okay. ASF5. ASF5 is such moribund patients that without operation, the patient is not going to survive, like a laparotomy or a patient of perforation peritonitis, especially if the patient is in shock. The patient is so moribund that if the patient does not undergo surgery, then the patient will never survive. Or the patient with ruptured aneurysm, again a moribund patient, and a condition, if not operated, the patient is not going to survive. And sixth is brain dead patient, and the patient is only for organ transplantation. And if an emergency has, then we add the alphabet E to that ASA grade. I love to repeat this once more, please. ASA1 is normal healthy patient. ASA2 is a mild systemic disease without any functional limitation. ASA3 is a severe systemic disease with functional limitation. ASA4 is a severe systemic disease which is a constant threat to the life. ASA5 is a moribund patient who is not going to survive if no surgery done. And ASA6 is brain dead patient. Let's have two examples. Like 48 years, history of stable angina, becomes dyspneic. The patient becomes dyspneic when he's walking. So what is the category of the patient? So such patient has a limitation, right? Such a patient has a limitation. So this patient falls into which category? This patient will fall into the category of ASA 3. The patient has ASA 3 category, right? Because there is a systemic disease with functional limitation, because the patient is becoming dyspneic. Second, uncontrolled hypertension with ruptured aortic aneurysm. As already discussed, this is ASA 5. That the patient is not going to survive if the surgery does not take place. Other than that, we have two more indexing. One is the NYHA classification for heart failure patients and the Canadian Cardiovascular Society grading for angina pectoris. In both of them, they are quite similar to each other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, normal patient. 2, the patient becomes dyspneic or the patient shows signs and symptoms of angina pectoris in more than normal activity. 3, at less than normal activity, either the patient is dyspneic or the patient shows the signs and symptoms of angina. And class 4, even at rest, the patient is dyspneic. I repeat, class 1, perfect patient. 2, mild symptoms are there, and that too on strenuous activities more than the normal activity. Stage 3, less than the normal activity. And stage 4, even at rest, the patient has signs and symptoms. Moving over to the last of the risk factors. See, nausea and vomiting is something which is quite debilitating for the patients post-operatively. But the beauty of this is that this can be prevented if we give the medications prophylactically before the operation and intraoperatively too. So there are certain risk factors that we all have to remember, so that if more than this is present or more than the 2 or 3 risk factors are there, then we can give a multimodal drug therapy to the patient so as to avoid the PONV. And this criteria is known by the name of MPhil. Please remember that name. This is MPhil criteria. We have patient-specific risk factors like females, patient who had no history of smoking, or the patient who had a history of prior PONV. Then anesthesia, your volatile anesthetics, nitrous oxide, and opioids. All the three can increase the chances of PONV. And lastly, the surgical risk factors like certain types of surgery, like your middle ear surgeries, your surgeries like laparoscopic surgeries, or the surgeries of more than 1 or 2 hours. That is, after every 30 minutes of the surgery, the risk of PNV go on increasing. So if we have the list of the risk factors, then we can provide the patient with a multimodal drug therapy using ondansetron, that are your 5-HT3 antagonist, dexamethasone, steroids, or even prokinetics like metoclopramides can be used. Or in some cases, even transdermal patch of hyoscine or scopolamine is used. Okay. Now moving to the almost the last parts, the pre-operative investigations check. I've already told you this is the era of minimum investigations. Only they are guided by history, the comorbidities, the physical status, and the proposed surgery. We have to give only those investigations to the patient which are actually required. The first thing and the foremost asked is ASA 1 and 2. If investigations done within the last 2 months, you need not repeat any investigation. Okay. What all investigations do we order? Complete blood count to check the hemoglobin and your platelets, your TLC count. Importance: hemoglobin. For all the elective surgeries, we take the limit of hemoglobin to be 10 gram per deciliter. Okay. So minimum hemoglobin that has to be there for an elective surgery is 10 gram per deciliter. But the transfusion trigger for non-cardiac patient is 7 grams per deciliter, and for cardiac patient it is 8 grams per deciliter. This is something you have to remember. Okay. The transfusion trigger for a non-cardiac patient is 7 grams per deciliter, and for a cardiac patient it is 8 grams per deciliter. Then TLC will tell us about the infections. Platelets. For a elective surgery, the platelets have to be above 80,000. For giving regional anesthesia, the platelets have to be above 50,000. And for neurosurgeries, we have to maintain the platelets 1 lakh. These three are very, very important numbers to remember. For elective, more than 80,000 platelets are acceptable. For regional, at least 50,000 platelets have to be there. And for neurosurgeries, 1 lakh platelets. But the trigger for the transfusion of platelets is 10,000. Okay, the trigger is 10,000 platelets until and unless the patient is bleeding. Then we have the RFTs, the blood sugars, liver profile, and the coagulation profile, in which we do the APTT or INR. And all this depends upon the comorbidity or the proposed surgery of the patient. Coming to ECG and X-ray, generally recommended after 45 years in females and 40 years in males. Okay, I repeat, ECG and X-rays are generally recommended in males above 40 and females above 45 years. It need not be done in each and every case. There are certain other investigations which could be ordered, for example, UPT. I have already told in the previous class that if you're dealing with amenorrhea in reproductive age group women, kindly get a UPT done. And this is one, recently it was asked in one of the papers about the brain natriuretic peptide, generally used to rule out CHF and troponin levels to rule out your acute coronary syndrome or MI. So the value of brain natriuretic peptide which are taken is less than 92 nanogram per liter, which is normal, or pro-BNP is also done these days. So the investigation of choice to rule out CHF is pro-BNP. Then ABG. ABG is only recommended in cases which have, acute respiratory failures or respiratory illness, or the patient who have come in casualty with sepsis posted for certain emergency procedures. Coming over to the pre-operative advice that has to be given to the patient. First and the foremost, informed written consent in language that the patient understands has to be taken. Okay, and this is the time when counseling of the patient also has to be done, so that the patient has realistic expectations from the surgery as well as anesthesia. Then the jewelry has to be removed, cosmetics have to be removed, all the artificial dentures, limbs, contact lenses have to be removed. Good oral hygiene has to be maintained, and there are certain medications that can be given one night prior. For example, your anti-anxiety medications or the medications for decreasing the risk of aspiration, which are aspiration prophylaxis. Your anti-anxiety medications will include your benzodiazepines, and your aspiration prophylaxis medication will include your Ondane, metoclopramide, or you can give pantoprazole, etc. Even some people still give sodium citrate also. Not liked by a lot of people, but yes, some people do give sodium citrate also. This is extremely important. That are your fasting guidelines. Fasting guidelines, why were they made? They were made to decrease the chances of aspiration, because the recommended gastric volume, double asterisk, double star. The recommended gastric volume is less than 25 ml with pH less than 2.5, pH more than 2.5, which is recommended to decrease the chances of aspiration. The gastric volume has to be 25 ml or less. These days it can be tested by using your point of care ultrasound also. So the time is 2 hours. Clear liquids water can be taken. By clear liquid, it is pulp-free. Juice, black coffee or black tea without milk can be taken. 4 hours for breast milk, 6 hours for formula milk or any light food, and 8 hours for fat rich food. So it is 2, 4, 6, 8. 2 hours for water or clear liquids, 4 hours for breast milk, 6 for the infant formula milk or any light food, and 8 hours if the patient has taken a fat rich food. If the patient is on enteral tube feeds, okay, like feeding jejunostomy, then the last meal that has to be given is again 8 hours prior to surgery. Okay, the patient has to be given the meal 8 hours prior to surgery. If the patient has a surgically placed post pyloric tube feeds, then you can continue until the time of non-abdominal surgeries. Okay, these patients who are on post pyloric tube feeds, they can be continued but only for non-abdominal surgeries. Now, very interesting thing comes like chewing gums. Now, if someone has taking or eating chewing gum, that generates saliva, which is treated like a clear liquid. But if someone swallows the chewing gum, then that is a solid food, and then we have to wait till 6 hours. Now, this is one of the questions that was asked in a previous year paper, that were the chewing gums. And now, if the patient is not willing to take the medication with water, is adamant, then 6 hours prior to surgery, you can give the patient certain honey or apple sauce so that the medication can be taken. Moving to the last of the slides, which are the pre-operative medications that the patient has to be given. The first are the anti-selagogues. This is to decrease the secretions. And this is glycopyrrolate, atropine or scopolamine. See, glycopyrrolate is the preferred one because it has very good anti-selagogue activity and very less vagolytic activity, and almost nil sedation because this is a quaternary compound, so it does not cross your blood-brain barrier. Talking about the atropine, it is a good anti-selagogue but not as good as glyco. It is a good vagolytic and it can cause sedation because it is a tertiary compound. And talking about scopolamine, generally given to increase sedation. The second are the anti-anxiety drugs, that are your benzodiazepines. Then certain analgesic which are given prior to your surgical incision are used these days by the name of preemptive analgesia. It is also preferred. Kindly remember the term preemptive analgesia, in which analgesic drugs like opioids or NSAIDs can be given before the surgical incision of the patient, and it has been shown to decrease the analgesic requirements intraoperatively. Then your prokinetics like metoclopramide, antiemetics like dexamethasone, ondansetron, or your H2 receptor blockers and PPIs. Some patients are told some doctors still prefer to give sodium citrate, that is 0.3 molars, 30 ml 30 minutes prior to the procedure. And this is exceptionally obsolete now. And for sedation and amnesia, the patient can be given again benzodiazepines or your benzodiazepine like your midazolam, diazepam, or lorazepam. Sorry for the spell. Lorazepam. Now, lastly, talking about the antibiotics. See, antibiotics have to be given 1 hour prior to the incision. Please remember this. See, the choice of antibiotics is through the institution. So, the antibiotics have to be administered at least 1 hour prior to the incision. If the option is not there of prior to the incision, then go with the option prior to induction of anesthesia. Done? With the exceptions of two, and the two exceptions are vancomycin, which has to be given 2 hours prior to incision, and second are tonique. If the tonique has to be inflated, then the antibiotic has to be given just prior to the inflation of the tonique. These are two exceptions, vancomycin and tonique. And do we have to repeat the antibiotics? Yes. If there is major blood loss that is taking place intraoperatively, and secondly, if the surgical time has exceeded 4 hours. So these are some of the exceptions, like vancomycin has to be given at least 2 hours prior. And when do we have to actually repeat the antibiotics? Then yes, major blood loss, or if the surgical duration has been more than 4 hours, then antibiotics are repeated. So this was all for the pre-anesthetic assessment. I hope the things are understandable, and we'll meet again for the next class soon. Thank you.